Millionaire, upon visiting his wife's grave, finds a little girl sitting on the tombstone and is shocked when he discovers who she is. The cemetery was silent that Saturday morning. The leaves of the trees swayed gently in the breeze, creating a whisper that seemed like an eternal lament. Among the marble and granite tombstones, a solitary figure advanced with slow but determined steps. Richard Anderson, a 70-year-old man, carried a bouquet of white roses in his hands, wrinkled by time. His face, marked by years and experiences, showed a mixture of pain and determination. Every Saturday without fail, Richard walked that path to the grave of his beloved wife, Elizabeth Taylor. It was a ritual he had religiously maintained since her passing 5 years ago. Upon reaching the white marble tombstone, Richard stopped. Carefully, he removed the withered flowers from the previous week and replaced them with the fresh ones he had brought. His fingers gently caressed the name engraved on the stone: Elizabeth Taylor, Anderson, beloved wife and mother. "Good morning, my love," Richard murmured, his voice husky with emotion. "Another Saturday, here I am, you know. I dreamed of you last night. We were on that beach where we spent our honeymoon. Your laughter filled the air, Elizabeth. How I miss you." Richard sat on the small bench he had installed next to the grave. From there he began to talk to Elizabeth as if she were sitting beside him. He told her about his week, the business, the world news. It was his way of keeping her close, of feeling that they still shared their lives. He was so absorbed in his monologue that he didn't notice the small figure approaching from behind the tombstone. It was only when he heard a soft sigh that Richard looked up, surprised to see a girl of about 8 years old sitting on the other side of Elizabeth's grave. The little girl had brown hair tied in 2 braids and big brown eyes that looked curiously at Richard. In her hands, she held a wildflower she had picked from the path. "Hello," said the girl in a sweet voice. "Were you friends with Mrs. Elizabeth?" Richard, still surprised by the sudden appearance, took a few seconds to respond. "Yes, I was. She was my wife," he finally said with a small smile. "And you? Did you know Elizabeth?" The girl shook her head. "No, but I like to come here. It's a quiet place to read," she explained, showing a small book she was carrying. "Besides, my name is Elizabeth. Like the lady in the grave, I thought it was a funny coincidence." Richard's heart skipped a beat when he heard the girl's name. "Your name is Elizabeth?" he asked, unable to hide his astonishment. The little girl nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, my mom says it's a very pretty name. Do you like it?" "I think it's the most beautiful name in the world," Richard responded sincerely, feeling his eyes moisten. Just at that moment, a female voice was heard in the distance. "Elizabeth, where are you, sweetheart?" The girl jumped to her feet. "It's my mom. I have to go," she said, and then looked at Richard with a smile. "Will you be here next Saturday? I'd like to talk to you again." Richard nodded, moved by the innocence and warmth of the little girl. "I'll be here, Elizabeth. Take care." As he watched the girl run away, Richard couldn't help but feel that something strange was happening. The appearance of this little Elizabeth right at his wife's grave seemed more than a simple coincidence. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of curiosity and hope ignite in his heart. "Elizabeth, my love," he whispered, looking at the tombstone, "is this a sign from you?" With that question resonating in his mind, Richard slowly got up from the bench. He took one last look at his wife's grave, and then looked in the direction where little Elizabeth had disappeared. With renewed steps, he headed towards the cemetery exit, feeling that something important was about to happen in his life. The morning sun now shone more brightly, as if the sky itself wanted to illuminate the path towards a new chapter in Richard Anderson's life. A chapter that, without knowing it yet, would change not only his destiny, but that of his entire family. The week passed with an overwhelming slowness for Richard. For the first time in years, he eagerly awaited the arrival of Saturday, not only for his usual visit to Elizabeth, but for the possibility of seeing again the little girl who had appeared as if by magic in his life. When the day finally arrived, Richard headed to the cemetery earlier than usual. His heart was beating with a mixture of hope and nervousness as he walked among the tombstones holding his bouquet of white roses. Upon reaching Elizabeth's grave, he was surprised to see that the girl was already there, sitting on the ground with her book on her lap. She looked up when she heard Richard's steps and gave him a radiant smile. "You came back?" exclaimed the little girl with joy. Richard couldn't help but smile. "Of course, I promised you and your mum." "She's over there," Elizabeth responded, pointing towards some nearby bushes. "I asked her to let me come say hello to you." At that moment, a young woman in her 30s approached with cautious steps. She had the same brown hair as the girl and green eyes that looked at Richard with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Good morning," the woman greeted. "I'm Sarah Miller, Elizabeth's mother. My daughter has talked a lot about you since last week." Richard extended his hand to greet her. "Richard Anderson, pleased to meet you, Sarah." Upon hearing the surname, Sarah visibly paled. Her eyes opened wide and she instinctively took a step back. "Anderson? Are you related to Michael Anderson?" The question took Richard by surprise. Michael was his son's name, with whom he had not had contact in more than a decade. "Michael is my son," he responded with a trembling voice. "Do you know him?" Sarah seemed to struggle internally for a few moments before responding. Finally, with a sigh, she said, "Mr. Anderson, I think we have a lot to talk about, Elizabeth," she addressed the girl. "Why don't you go? Play for a while I talk with Mr. Richard?" The little girl nodded and walked away, leaving the two adults alone in front of Elizabeth Taylor's grave. "Mr. Anderson," Sarah began, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to say this, but Elizabeth is your granddaughter, Michael is her father." The words hit Richard like a hammer. He staggered, having to lean on the tombstone to avoid falling. My granddaughter," he managed to articulate. "But how? Michael? He left years ago. I never knew." Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. "Michael and I met 9 years ago. It was an intense but brief love. When I discovered I was pregnant, he had already gone. I could never locate him to tell him about Elizabeth." Richard felt the world spinning around him. He had a granddaughter, a beautiful girl who bore the name of his beloved wife. And Michael, his lost son, was a father. Without knowing it. "Sarah," said Richard, taking the woman's hands in his, "I need to find Michael. He needs to meet his daughter, to know he has a family. Please, help me." Sarah hesitated for a moment, but seeing the sincerity in Richard's eyes, she slowly nodded. "All right, Mr. Anderson, but I must warn you, Michael had his reasons for walking away. It won't be easy." "I know," Richard replied with determination, "but now I have one more reason to try for Elizabeth. For my granddaughter, I'll do whatever is necessary." As little Elizabeth played in the distance, oblivious to the drama unfolding, Richard and Sarah began to devise a plan to find Michael. The cemetery, which for years had been a place of mourning for Richard, was now becoming the setting for a new beginning, an opportunity to heal old wounds and build a future together as a family. Richard looked up at the sky as if seeking approval from his late wife. "Elizabeth, my love," he thought, "help me fix this. Help me bring our family back together." With that silent plea, Richard prepared to embark on the most important mission of his life, to recover his son and truly get to know his granddaughter. The road would be difficult, full of obstacles and buried emotions, but he was willing to face it all for the promise of a new beginning. The days following the revelation in the cemetery were a whirlwind of emotions and activity for Richard Anderson. With Sarah's help, he began the arduous task of locating Michael. His lost son, Richard, mobilized all the resources at his disposal. He hired private investigators, used his contacts in the business world, and even turned to old friends who might have some clue about Michael's whereabouts. Meanwhile, Richard took advantage of every moment to get to know his newly discovered granddaughter, Elizabeth, better. The girl, oblivious to the magnitude of the situation, enjoyed the attention of her new, older friend, as she called him. Richard took her to the park, bought her ice cream, and spent hours talking about her favorite books. Every gesture, every smile from Elizabeth reminded him of both his late wife and Michael when he was little. Sarah observed this growing relationship with a mixture of joy and concern. On one hand, she was happy that Elizabeth finally had a father figure in her life, even if it was her grandfather. On the other, she feared Michael's reaction when they found him. How would he take the news that he had a daughter? And how would he react to knowing that his father, from whom he had distanced himself so many years ago, was now part of Elizabeth's life? After weeks of fruitless searching, the news they had been waiting for finally arrived. One of the investigators had located Michael in a small coastal town several hundred miles away. According to the report, Michael was living a simple life, working as a literature teacher at a local school. Richard, his heart racing, made the decision to personally go look for his son. Sarah insisted on accompanying him, arguing that Michael would need to know about Elizabeth firsthand. "And what will we do with Elizabeth?" asked Richard, concerned about how all this would affect the girl. Sarah sighed. "I think it's better if she stays with my sister for now. We don't know how Michael will react, and I don't want to expose Elizabeth to a potentially painful situation." Richard nodded, understanding the wisdom in Sarah's words. That night, as he packed for the trip, he couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and fear. What would the reunion with Michael be like after so many years? Could he repair the damage caused by years of estrangement? The car ride was long and tense. Richard drove in silence, lost in his thoughts, while Sarah looked out the window, imagining what Elizabeth's father would be like after so many years. Finally, they arrived at the small coastal town. Following the investigators' directions, they headed to a modest house near the beach. Richard parked the car and for a moment remained paralyzed, unable to move. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sarah asked softly. Richard looked at her, his eyes full of determination. "I have to do it. For Michael, for Elizabeth, for all of us." With trembling steps, they approached the door and rang the doorbell. The seconds that followed seemed eternal. Finally, the door opened, revealing a man in his 40s with the same dark hair as Richard and Sarah's green eyes. Michael looked at them, first with confusion, then with shock as he recognized his father. His gaze passed from Richard to Sarah and back to Richard. "Dad?" he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. What are you doing here?" Richard, struggling to hold back tears, responded, "Michael, my son. We have a lot to talk about." Michael looked at Sarah, recognition shining in his eyes. "Sarah, is that you?" Sarah nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Hello, Michael. It's been a long time." The shock on Michael's face was evident. He looked at his father again, and then at Sarah, trying to understand the situation. Finally, with a trembling voice, he said, "Come in, please. I think we have a lot to talk about." The three entered Michael's modest house. The interior was cozy, with bookshelves full of books and some photographs on the walls. Michael led them to the living room, where they sat in an uncomfortable silence. Richard was the first to speak. "Michael, I know my presence here must be a surprise. So many years have passed." Michael interrupted him, his voice laden with pent-up emotions. "Why now, Dad? Why after all this time?" Richard took a deep breath, preparing to reveal the truth. "Michael, there's something you need to know, something that will change our lives forever." Sarah intervened, her voice soft but firm. "Michael, when you left 9 years ago, I didn't know I was pregnant. We have a daughter." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Michael remained motionless, his eyes wide open, processing the information. "A daughter," he finally managed to articulate. I have a daughter." Richard nodded, taking a photograph from his pocket and handing it to Michael. "Her name is Elizabeth, like your mother. She's 8 years old and is the most wonderful girl you can imagine." Michael took the photograph with trembling hands. Upon seeing Elizabeth's smiling face, something broke inside him. Tears began to fall down his cheeks as he caressed the image of his unknown daughter. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked Sarah, his voice broken with emotion. Sarah lowered her gaze, ashamed. "I tried, Michael. I looked for you for months, but you had completely disappeared. No one knew where you were." Michael closed his eyes, remembering those dark days when he decided to distance himself from everything and everyone. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I'm so sorry." Richard approached his son, putting a hand on his shoulder. "We all made mistakes, Michael, me more than anyone, but now we have the opportunity to fix things, to be a family." Michael looked at his father, years of resentment and pain reflected in his eyes. "It's not that simple, Dad. You can't show up after so many years and expect everything to be solved overnight." "I know," Richard responded humbly. "I don't expect you to forgive me immediately. I'm just asking for a chance. For Elizabeth, for your daughter. She deserves to know her father." Michael remained silent for a long moment, looking at Elizabeth's photograph. Finally, with a deep sigh, he said, "You're right, Elizabeth deserves to know me, and I want to know her, but I need time. All of this is too much to take in at once." Sarah smiled with relief. "Of course, Michael, we'll take things slow. The important thing is that you're willing to be part of Elizabeth's life." Richard, feeling that the first step towards reconciliation had been taken, suggested, "What do you say if we go back to the city together? You can meet Elizabeth, and we'll take things step by step." Michael nodded slowly. "Okay, let me sort out some things at the school and pack. I'll catch up with you in a few days." As Richard and Sarah prepared to leave, Michael stopped them at the door. "Dad," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "thank you for coming to find me, and Sarah, thank you for giving me a daughter. I promise I'll do everything I can to be the father Elizabeth deserves." With emotional hugs and promises of reunion, Richard and Sarah said goodbye to Michael. As they drove back to the city, both felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The first step had been taken, but they knew that the road to reconciliation and building a true family would be long and full of challenges. What none of them knew was that, as they drove away from the small coastal town, a dark figure was watching them from the shadows. Victor Hawkins, Richard's old enemy, had been following their movements. With a malicious smile, he took out his phone and dialed a number. "I found them," he said in a cold voice. "It's time to put our plan into motion." The following days were an emotional roller coaster for everyone involved. Richard and Sarah returned to the city, eager to share the news with Elizabeth. The little girl, who had been in the care of Sarah's sister, was excited at the prospect of meeting her father. "What's he like, Mom?" Elizabeth asked over and over, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Does he look like me?" Sarah smiled, stroking her daughter's hair. "He has your same eyes, sweetie, and I'm sure he's going to adore you." Meanwhile, Richard immersed himself in preparations for Michael's arrival. He prepared a room in his mansion, hoping his son would agree to stay there, at least. Temporarily, he also began to think about how to integrate Michael into the family business, if he was interested. However, beneath the surface of this apparent happiness, darker currents were hidden. Victor Hawkins, Richard's old rival, had intensified his movements in the shadows. With the newly obtained information about Michael and Elizabeth, Hawkins saw the perfect opportunity to execute his revenge against the Andersons. One afternoon, while Richard was reviewing some documents in his study, he received an anonymous call. "Richard Anderson," said a distorted voice on the other end of the line. "I hope you're enjoying your family reunion. It would be a shame if something happened to your precious little granddaughter or your newly found son." Richard felt his blood run cold. "Who is this? What do you want?" The voice laughed coldly. "Let's say I'm someone to whom you owe a lot, Anderson, and the time has come to collect that debt. I'll be in touch." The call cut off, leaving Richard in a state of panic. He immediately called his head of security and doubled the protection around Sarah and Elizabeth, without revealing the real reason for this measure. In the midst of this hidden tension, the day of the reunion with Michael arrived. The young professor arrived at the Anderson mansion with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Richard greeted him at the door, trying to hide his concern about the recent threat. "Welcome home, son," said Richard, extending his arms for a hug that Michael, after a moment of hesitation, accepted. Sarah and Elizabeth were waiting in the living room. When Michael entered, there was a moment of silence charged with emotion. Elizabeth, shy for the first time in her life, partially hid behind her mother, Michael, knelt to be at the girl's height. "Hello, Elizabeth," he said softly. I'm your dad." Elizabeth looked at him with her big brown eyes, so similar to his slowly. She came out from behind Sarah and took a step towards Michael. "Hello, Dad," she whispered. It was as if a dam had broken. Michael hugged his daughter for the first time, tears running freely down his face. Sarah couldn't contain her crying, and even Richard had to wipe his eyes at the scene. The following days were of adaptation for everyone. Michael spent every possible moment with Elizabeth, trying to make up for lost years. Richard observed, with a mixture of joy and remorse, seeing in Michael and Elizabeth's relationship an echo of his own mistakes as a father. However, the threat from Victor Hawkins continued to hang over them like a dark cloud. Richard, determined to protect his newly reunited family, began to discreetly investigate, trying to discover who was behind the threats. One night, while everyone was having dinner together, Richard received another anonymous call. Excusing himself, he retired to his study to answer it. "Time is running out, Anderson," said the same distorted voice. "If you want to keep your family safe, you'll have to pay, and I'm not just talking about money." Richard, with his voice trembling with contained rage, responded, "I don't know who you are, but I swear if you touch a hair on my family, you'll pay dearly." The voice laughed. "Big words for someone who can't even protect his own. Look out the window, Richard." With his heart racing, Richard approached the window of his study. On the street, he saw a black car with tinted windows. The vehicle started slowly, passing in front of the mansion before disappearing into the night. "That could have been your granddaughter's last day at school, or your son's walk in the park," the voice continued. "Remember it, Anderson. We're closer than you think." The call cut off, leaving Richard in a state of panic and rage. He knew he had to act, but how could he protect his family without alerting them and destroying the fragile happiness they had built? Meanwhile, in the dining room, Michael and Sarah shared a look of concern. Both had noticed the change in Richard's behavior in recent days. "Do you think something's going on?" Sarah whispered. Michael frowned. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Whatever it is, I won't let anything threaten our family. Not now that we're finally together." What none of them knew was that the real test for the Anderson family was just beginning. The shadows of Richard's past loomed over them, threatening to destroy everything they had built. The following days passed in a strange balance between the joy of the reunited family and the growing tension that Richard tried to hide. Michael and Elizabeth forged an increasingly strong bond, spending hours playing in the mansion's garden or reading stories together. Sarah observed this connection with a mixture of happiness and a touch of melancholy, thinking of all the lost years. Richard, for his part, struggled internally. He knew he should inform his family about the threats, but he feared destroying the fragile happiness they had built. Besides, a part of him wanted to protect them by keeping them in ignorance. However, the weight of the secret was beginning to take its toll. One afternoon, while Michael was helping Elizabeth with her homework in the mansion's library, he noticed that his father seemed particularly distracted and nervous. "Dad," Michael called, "is everything okay? You've been acting strange lately." Richard, surprised by his son's direct question, tried to sketch a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine, Michael. Just business matters." But Michael wasn't convinced. Years of resentment and distrust weren't easily erased, and he could sense that something wasn't right. "Dad, if something's going on, we need to know. We're a family now, remember?" Those words hit Richard hard. Family. Yes, they were a family, and families didn't keep such important secrets. With a deep sigh, Richard made a decision. "You're right, Michael. There's something you all need to know. Can we meet in the study after dinner?" That night, after Elizabeth went to bed, Richard gathered Michael and Sarah in his study. With a grave voice, he began to reveal the truth about the threats they had been receiving. "A few days ago, I started receiving anonymous calls," he explained. "Someone is threatening our family, especially Elizabeth and you, Michael." Sarah stifled a cry, while Michael clenched his fists in rage. "Why didn't you tell us before?" he demanded to know. Richard lowered his gaze, ashamed. I wanted to protect you. I thought I could handle this alone, as I've always done. But I was wrong. We're a family, and we must face this together." Sarah, with tears in her eyes, asked, "Do you have any idea who might be behind this?" Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. "I have my suspicions. Years ago I had a conflict with a man named Victor Hawkins. He was a business rival, and our confrontation didn't end well for him." Michael listened attentively, connecting the dots in his mind. "Is that why I left, right? Because of your business?" Richard nodded slowly. "Partly, yes. I never wanted you to get involved in the dark side of business, Michael. I tried to protect you by keeping you away, but now I see that I only managed to push you away from me." A heavy silence fell over the room. Michael struggled internally with this new information, years of resentment mixing with concern for the safety of his newly discovered daughter. "What exactly does this Victor Hawkins want?" Michael finally asked. Breaking the silence, Richard passed, a hand over his face, visibly exhausted. "Revenge, I suppose, and probably a good part of the family fortune. But what worries me most is that he seems willing to hurt Elizabeth or you to get it." Sarah, who had remained silent, processing all the information, spoke with a trembling voice. "There's something you should know." Both men looked at her, surprised. "Years ago, shortly after Elizabeth was born, I received similar threats. At that time, I didn't know who was behind it, but now—" "What?" exclaimed Michael, rising from his chair. "Why did you never tell me?" Sarah looked at him with eyes full of tears. "How could I, Michael? You were gone. No one knew where you were. I was alone and scared. With a newborn baby, I did the only thing I could think of. I moved, changed jobs, tried to disappear." Richard, feeling the weight of guilt on his shoulders, approached Sarah. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. If I had been there to protect you." Michael, overwhelmed by the revelation, collapsed back into his chair. "All these years Elizabeth was in danger, and I didn't even know. What kind of father am I?" "No, Michael," Laura interrupted firmly. "Don't blame yourself. None of us could have known. The important thing is that we're together now, and we can protect Elizabeth." Richard nodded, a new determination shining in his eyes. "Sarah is right. We can't change the past, but we can make sure Elizabeth has a secure future. We have to work together to stop Hawkins once and for all." "And how do you propose we do that?" Michael asked, a mixture of skepticism and concern in his voice. "I have some contacts in the police and private security," Richard explained. "We can increase security around the house and Elizabeth, but we also need to be proactive. I'm going to hire the best investigators to track down Hawkins and gather evidence of his illegal activities." Sarah intervened. "We should also consider moving temporarily, maybe to a safe house. If Hawkins is watching us, it could be dangerous to stay here." Michael nodded slowly, processing all the information. "I agree, but what will we tell Elizabeth? She's a smart girl. She'll realize something is going on." The three looked at each other, aware of the delicate balance between protecting Elizabeth and not unnecessarily scaring her. "We'll tell her a simplified version of the truth," Richard suggested after a moment of reflection, "that due to Grandpa's work, we need to take some security precautions. She doesn't need to know all the details, but we shouldn't lie to her completely either." Michael and Sarah agreed with this approach. As they discussed the details of their plan, a feeling of unity began to grow among them. Despite the terrible circumstances, they were working together as a true family for the first time. At the end of the night, before retiring to their rooms, Michael approached his father. "Dad," he said, his voice charged with emotion, "I know we've had our differences and there's still a lot to resolve between us, but I want you to know that, whatever happens, we're in this together. For Elizabeth." Richard, moved by his son's words, hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Michael. I promise I'll do everything in my power to keep this family safe." Meanwhile, in a hotel room across town, Victor Hawkins observed the surveillance images of the Anderson mansion. A sinister smile drew on his face as he watched the family gathered in the study. "Enjoy your little family reunion while you can," he muttered to himself. "Soon, very soon, Richard Anderson will know what it's like to lose everything." With a gesture, Hawkins called one of his henchmen. "It's time to move on to the next phase of the plan, Make sure everything is ready." As the Anderson family prepared to face the threat looming over them, they were unaware that Victor Hawkins had an ace up his sleeve, a secret that threatened to destroy not only their fortune, but the very foundations of their newly rebuilt family. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for the Anderson family. Richard, true to his word, set in motion an elaborate security plan. The mansion became a virtual fortress with discreet but vigilant guards at every corner and state-of-the-art security systems installed in record time. Michael and Sarah took turns being with Elizabeth at all times, trying to maintain an appearance of normality while adapting to their new reality. The little girl, perceptive as always, noticed the changes but accepted the simplified explanation they gave her, with a maturity surprising for her age. "Is it like in spy movies, Grandpa?" Elizabeth asked one afternoon. As Richard accompanied her to her piano class, Richard couldn't help but smile at his granddaughter's innocence. "Something like that, my love. But don't worry. All this is just to make sure you're always safe." Meanwhile, Michael immersed himself in the investigation about Victor Hawkins, using his skills as a literature professor to meticulously analyze every document and record that could shed light on their enemy's activities. One night, while reviewing some old files in Richard's study, Michael made a startling discovery. "Dad," he called, his voice tense with emotion. "I think you should see this." Richard approached, intrigued. Michael showed him a set of documents dated more than 30 years ago. "According to this," Michael explained, "you and Hawkins weren't just business rivals. You were partners." Richard paled, taking the papers with trembling hands. I had forgotten about this. It was so long ago." "What happened?" Michael pressed, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension in his voice. Richard collapsed heavily into a chair, the weight of memories reflected on his face. "Victor and I were young, ambitious. We started together with a small import company. At first, everything was going well. We were unstoppable. But," Michael urged, feeling they were approaching the crux of the matter. "But ambition blinded us," Richard continued, his voice laden with regret. "We started taking shortcuts, making deals with people we shouldn't have. When I realized how deep we had fallen, I tried to get out Victor. He didn't take it. Well," Michael listened attentively, seeing his father in a new light. "What did you do?" "I reported him," Richard confessed. "I handed over evidence to the authorities about his illegal activities. I managed to stay out of it, but Victor lost everything. He went to prison for years." A heavy silence fell over the room as Michael processed this information. "And now he's back for revenge," he concluded. Richard nodded grimly. "And I fear he won't stop at anything to get it." At that moment, Sarah rushed into the study, her face pale with worry. "Richard, Michael, you have to see this." She led them to the living room where the TV was showing breaking news. The reporter spoke urgently. "A multi-million-dollar lawsuit has been filed against tycoon Richard Anderson. The plaintiff, Victor Hawkins, alleges that Anderson stole the idea and plans for his most successful company. 30 years ago, Hawkins claims to have irrefutable evidence and demands compensation that could amount to billions." The family watched the screen. In shock, Richard collapsed onto the sofa, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. "It's a lie," he murmured. "It's all a lie." Michael, quickly recovering from the initial surprise, turned to his father. "Is it, or is there some truth to his accusations?" Richard looked at his son, guilt and fear evident in his eyes. "Michael, I swear I didn't steal anything. But there are things from my past, decisions I made. Not everything is black and white." Sarah intervened, her voice trembling but determined. "It doesn't matter what happened in the past. What's important now is how we're going to face this." Michael nodded, though his mind was buzzing with unanswered questions. "Sarah's right. We need a plan. If Hawkins is willing to take this to court and the media, we have to be prepared." Richard sat up, a spark of his old determination returning to his eyes. "I'll contact our lawyers immediately, Michael. I need you to keep investigating. Anything you can find about Hawkins' current activities could be crucial." As the family mobilized to face this new threat, none of them noticed Elizabeth, who had been silently listening from the stairs. The girl, with a maturity beyond her years, understood that her family was in danger. With determination, she promised herself to do everything possible to help, although she wasn't sure how. What the Anderson family didn't know was that Victor Hawkins was just getting started. The lawsuit and media scandal were just the tip of the iceberg of a much more sinister plan, a plan that threatened to unearth even darker secrets from Richard's past and endanger not only his fortune, but the very lives of his loved ones. As night fell over the city, the Anderson mansion became the epicenter of a storm that threatened to sweep away everything in its path. The battle for the Anderson legacy was just beginning, and no one could foresee the high price they would all have to pay before it ended. The days following the media bomb launched by Victor Hawkins were a whirlwind of frantic activity for the Anderson family. Richard spent hours locked up with his lawyers, preparing his legal defense. Michael, for his part, immersed himself even more deeply in the investigation, determined to find something that could discredit Hawkins' accusations. Sarah, meanwhile, focused on keeping Elizabeth oblivious to the growing tension in the house. However, the perceptive girl felt that something wasn't right, and her questions became increasingly difficult to evade. One afternoon, while Michael was reviewing some old documents in the mansion's library, Elizabeth approached him with a serious expression on her childish face. "Dad," she said, her small voice firm, "why is everyone so worried? Is it because of the bad man who's on TV?" Michael was surprised, not expecting such a direct question. Putting the papers aside, he sat Elizabeth on his lap. "Elizabeth, honey, have you been listening to adult conversations?" The girl nodded, her eyes large and worried. "I didn't mean to spy, but everyone seems so scared. Are we in danger?" Michael felt his heart shrink. He wanted to protect his daughter, keep her oblivious to the problems, but he also knew that lying to her would only make things worse. "Elizabeth," he began, carefully choosing his words, "sometimes adults face complicated problems. Your grandfather Richard is dealing with one of those problems now. But I want you to know that we're all working together to solve it, and that no matter what happens, we'll keep you safe." Elizabeth seemed to consider this for a moment before hugging her father tightly. "I want to help too," she declared with determination. Michael smiled, moved by his daughter's bravery. "I know, my love, and you help us more than you think, simply by being yourself and filling this house with joy." Meanwhile, in his study, Richard was receiving a call that would change the course of events. It was one of his private investigators. "Mr. Anderson," said the voice on the other end of the line, "we've discovered something about Victor Hawkins that I think you should know." Richard leaned forward, his heart racing. "I'm listening." "Hawkins isn't acting alone," continued the investigator. "We've found evidence that he's working with someone from inside your own company, someone who has been passing him confidential information." Richard felt his blood run cold. "A mole? Do you have any idea who it might be?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, the evidence points to someone very close to you, someone from your inner circle." Richard closed his eyes, a feeling of betrayal washing over him. "Tell me," he demanded with a tense voice. The investigator took a deep breath before responding. "Mr. Anderson, all the evidence points to your personal assistant, Nancy Thompson. She's been working for you for over 20 years, but it seems she's been leaking information to Hawkins for the past few months." The news hit Richard like a punch in the stomach. Nancy had been more than an assistant. She was almost family, someone he implicitly trusted. The idea of her betrayal was almost inconceivable. "I need concrete proof," said Richard, his voice barely a whisper. "Send it to me immediately, and don't share this information with anyone else." After hanging up, Richard remained motionless in his chair, trying to process this new information. How could Nancy, after so many years of loyalty, betray him like this? What could have led her to ally with Hawkins? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Michael. "Dad," he said, entering the study with a worried expression, "I just received an anonymous call. Someone says they have crucial information about the Hawkins case, but they'll only speak to me in person. They want me to meet them tonight." Richard immediately stood up, alarmed. "No, it's too dangerous. It could be a trap set by Hawkins." Michael shook his head. "I know, But it could also be our only chance to get something that helps us discredit him. We can't let this opportunity pass." Richard hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect his son and the desperate need for any advantage against Hawkins. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. "All right, but you won't go alone. You'll take a security team and use a tracking device." As Richard and Michael discussed the details of the meeting, Sarah entered the study, her face pale with concern. "Richard, Michael," she said with a trembling voice, "I just received a very strange text message from Nancy. She says she needs to talk to me urgently, in private, that she has vital information about Hawkins and Elizabeth's safety." Richard and Michael exchanged alarmed looks. Richard knew he had to act quickly but also cautiously. He couldn't reveal his suspicions about Nancy without concrete proof. "Sarah," said Richard carefully, "I think you should meet with Nancy, but not alone. Michael will accompany you." Michael began to protest, mentioning his own meeting, but Richard interrupted him. "Your meeting can wait. Sarah's safety and any information about Elizabeth are the priority." Reluctantly, Michael agreed. Richard watched them leave with a heavy heart, knowing he was sending his son and Sarah into a potential trap, but trusting that together they would be safer. Meanwhile, in a cafe across town, Nancy Tombstone waited nervously. Her phone vibrated with a message. "Is it done?" With trembling hands, she replied, "Yes, they're on their way." What no one in the Anderson family knew was that Nancy was trapped in her own dilemma. Hawkins had been blackmailing her with information that could destroy not only her career but also her family. Every action she took tore her apart inside, torn between her loyalty to the Andersons and the terror of what Hawkins might do. As night fell over the city, the different threads of the plot began to intertwine. Michael and Sarah were heading to their meeting with Nancy, unaware of the danger that awaited them. Richard, alone in the mansion, struggled with guilt and fear, aware that every decision he made could have catastrophic consequences. And somewhere, hidden in the shadows, Victor Hawkins watched as his plan unfolded, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "Soon, Richard," he muttered to himself, "soon you'll know what it's like to lose everything." The night promised to be long and full of revelations that would shake the very foundations of the Anderson family. Long-buried secrets were about to come to light, and no one would be prepared for the consequences. The night had fallen over the city, enveloping its streets in a cloak of darkness and mystery. Michael drove in silence with Sarah by his side, both immersed in their own thoughts as they headed to the meeting with Nancy. The air inside the car was charged with tension and anticipation. "Do you think she really has information about Elizabeth?" Sarah asked. Breaking the silence, Michael gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I don't know, but we can't risk ignoring it. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Meanwhile, in the Anderson mansion, Richard paced back and forth in his study, consumed by anxiety. He had sent his son and Sarah to what could potentially be a trap, and guilt was eating away at him. His phone rang, startling him. "Anderson," he answered with a tense voice. "Ah, Richard, old friend." Victor Hawkins' voice sounded mocking on the other end of the line. "I hope you're enjoying this little chess game we're playing." Richard felt anger bubbling inside him. "What do you want, Hawkins? Haven't you caused enough damage already?" Hawkins laughed softly. "Oh, I'm just getting started, Richard. You know, I always admired your business acumen, your cunning, but you forgot the most important lesson. Never trust anyone completely." Richard's heart raced. "What have you done?" "I haven't done anything," Hawkins replied with false innocence. "But maybe you should ask yourself who you've been trusting all these years. The people closest to us are often the ones who can hurt us the most, don't you think?" Before Richard could respond, Hawkins hung up, leaving him with a feeling of dread in his stomach. Elsewhere in the city, Michael and Sarah arrived at the agreed meeting point with Nancy. It was a small park, dark and practically deserted at this hour of the night. They advanced cautiously, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Nancy," Sarah called softly, upon seeing a figure sitting on a nearby bench. The woman turned towards them, and both were surprised to see her haggard and fear-filled face. Nancy, always so composed and professional, seemed to have aged years in a matter of days. "Sarah, Michael," she said with a trembling voice. "I'm so sorry, I didn't want things to come to this point." Michael took a step forward, his posture tense. "What are you talking about, Nancy? What's going on?" Nancy opened her mouth to respond, but before she could do so, the park was suddenly illuminated by the glare of several car headlights. Dark figures emerged from the shadows surrounding them. "Well, well," said a familiar voice. Victor Hawkins emerged from among the shadows, a triumphant smile on his face. "It seems our little meeting is complete." Michael instinctively moved to protect Sarah, his mind working frantically to find a way out. "Hawkins," he growled, "what does this mean?" Hawkins approached, his eyes shining with malice. "It means, my dear Michael, that it's time for your family to pay for your father's sins. And thanks to the invaluable help of Nancy here, I'm about to destroy everything Richard Anderson has built." Nancy sobbed softly, guilt evident on her face. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. He threatened my family. I had no choice." Sarah looked at Nancy with a mixture of compassion and betrayal. "There's always a choice, Nancy. We could have helped you if you had told us." Hawkins clapped sarcastically. "How touching. But I'm afraid explanations will have to wait. We have business to attend to." With a gesture of his hand, his men began to approach Michael and Sarah. Michael, desperate, looked for a way out, but they were completely surrounded. "What do you want from us, Hawkins?" Michael asked, trying to buy time. Hawkins smiled, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "Oh, I want many things, Michael. But for now, I'll settle for using you as bargaining chips. You see, your father has something that belongs to me, and you're going to help me get it back." While this was happening back at the Anderson mansion, Richard received another call, this time from his security team. "Mr. Anderson, we've lost contact with Mr. Michael's tracking device." Richard felt the world crumbling around him. His worst fears were coming true. With trembling hands, he dialed Michael's number, praying for an answer he knew wouldn't come. Meanwhile, in the park, Hawkins ordered his men to take Michael and Sarah to some waiting cars nearby. "It's time to pay a little visit to your father, Michael. I have a feeling he'll be very anxious to see us." Michael struggled against his captors, but it was useless. As they pushed him towards the car, his eyes met Sarah's, sharing a moment of fear and determination. Whatever happens, they silently promised each other they would find a way to protect Elizabeth and the family. The night loomed over, the city dark and threatening, as events rushed towards a climax that threatened to destroy everything the Anderson family had built. The secrets of the past and the betrayals of the present were intertwining in a deadly web, and no one was safe from the consequences that were coming. The Anderson mansion, once a symbol of power and security, now seemed like a besieged fortress. Richard, his face haggard with worry and lack of sleep, paced his study like a caged lion. Frantic calls to the police, and his contacts had yielded no results. Michael and Sarah were still missing. The silence of the night was broken by the shrill sound of the phone. Richard pounced on it, his heart beating hard. "Richard Anderson," he answered with a tense voice. "Ah, Richard." Victor Hawkins' voice sounded almost jovial on the other end of the line. "I hope I didn't wake you, though I imagine sleep is a luxury you can't afford right now, isn't it?" Richard gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Where are they, Hawkins? If you've hurt them, I swear I'll—" "Calm, calm," Hawkins interrupted. "Your son and his charming, what should we call her, girlfriend, mother of his child, whatever. They're perfectly safe for now." "What do you want?" Richard growled, desperation evident in his voice. Hawkins laughed softly on the other end of the line. "What I've always wanted, Richard, justice, recognition, and of course what you stole from me so many years ago." Richard closed his eyes, the weight of his past falling on him like a slab. "You know I can't give you that, Victor. Those documents, they would destroy more than just me." "Precisely," Hawkins replied, his voice now cold as ice. "It's time for you to pay for your sins, Richard. And if you're not willing to sacrifice yourself, well, I'm afraid your son and Sarah will pay the price." Richard's heart stopped for a moment. "Tell me what I have to do," he whispered. "In defeat." "That's better," Hawkins said with satisfaction. I want you to bring the original documents of Project Phoenix to the old warehouse at the Port Come tomorrow at midnight alone. If I see a single policeman or bodyguard, you can say goodbye to your precious family." Before Richard could respond, the line went dead. He collapsed into his chair, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Project Phoenix, he had hoped that part of his past would remain buried forever. Meanwhile, in an unknown location, Michael and Sarah were locked in a dark, damp room. Michael pulled at the bindings that kept him tied to a chair, but it was useless. "Michael, please, stop," Sarah pleaded. "You're only going to hurt yourself." Michael stopped struggling, looking at Sarah with a mixture of frustration and fear. "We can't just sit here doing nothing. Elizabeth needs us." Sarah nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "I know, but we need to be smart. Hawkins wants us alive for now. That gives us time." At that moment, the door opened and Nancy entered, carrying a tray with water and some food. Her face was pale and haggard, guilt evident in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she murmured as she set down the tray. "I never wanted this to happen." Michael looked at her with a mixture of anger and pity. "Why, Nancy? Why did you betray my father?" Nancy collapsed, tears running down her cheeks. "Hawkins, he has my son. He threatened to kill him if I didn't cooperate. I had no choice," Sarah gasped, understanding dawning on her face. "Your son, the one everyone thought had died in that accident years ago." Nancy nodded, sobbing. "Hawkins saved him, but only to use him against me. I've been his puppet all these years, passing him information, betraying the family that took me in as one of their own." Michael felt his anger fading, replaced by deep compassion. "Nancy, it's not too late. Help us get out of here. Together we can stop Hawkins." Nancy hesitated, fear evident on her face. "I can't, my son." "We'll find a way to save him too," Sarah promised, "but we need your help." Before Nancy could respond, footsteps were heard approaching. Quickly, she left the room, casting a last apologetic look before closing the door. Back at the Anderson mansion, Richard had made a decision. He couldn't risk Michael and Sarah's lives, but he also couldn't hand over the Project Phoenix documents to Hawkins. The consequences would be catastrophic. With trembling hands, he dialed a number he had sworn he would never use again. "It's me," he said when they answered. "I need your help. It's about Project Phoenix." The voice on the other end of the line took a moment to respond. "After all these years, it must be serious." "It is," Richard confirmed. "Hawkins is back, and he has my family I need. You to gather the old team. It's time to finish what we started." "Understood," the voice replied. "We'll meet at the usual place in an hour." Richard hung up, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. He was about to unearth a past he had fought to keep hidden for decades, but if it meant saving his family and stopping Hawkins once and for all, he was willing to pay the price. As he prepared to leave, Richard looked at the photo of Elizabeth on his desk. "I promise you, my girl," he whispered, "that I'll do everything in my power to keep this family safe." With that silent promise, Richard Anderson left his study, ready to face the ghosts of his past and fight for his family's future. The night was young, and the events that would unfold in the coming hours would change the fate of the Andersons forever. The night enveloped the city in a cloak of darkness. When Richard Anderson arrived at the meeting place, it was an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts, a site he hadn't visited in decades. Upon entering, he was greeted by familiar faces, though aged by time and worries. "Welcome, Richard," said a deep voice from the shadows. A tall man with grey hair emerged, his eyes still sharp despite the years. It was Gabriel Soto, Richard's former partner and a key player in Project Phoenix. Richard nodded in acknowledgement. "Gabriel, thank you for coming. Is everyone here?" Gabriel gestured towards the gathered group. "All who are left. Time hasn't been kind to us, old friend." As Richard greeted his former colleagues, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the years and the secrets they had shared. Project Phoenix, an ambitious technological development plan that had begun with the best intentions but had twisted into something much darker. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice laden with urgency, "I know we all swore never to speak of Project Phoenix again, But circumstances have forced us to break that. Oath Victor Hawkins has returned, and he has my family." A murmur of concern ran through the group. Gabriel stepped forward, his face grim. "What exactly does he want?" "The original documents," Richard replied. "Everything related to the final phase of the project." Another of those present, a short man named Ramon, intervened. "But those documents, if they fall into the wrong hands—" "I know," Richard interrupted. "That's why I need them not to hand them over to Hawkins, but to destroy them once and for all." Gabriel looked at Richard intensely. "Are you sure about this, Richard? Those documents are the only thing that protects us if we destroy them." "It's a risk we must take," Richard affirmed with determination. "I've lived too long with this weight on my shoulders. It's time to do the right thing, regardless of the personal consequences." As the group discussed the details of the plan elsewhere in the city, Michael and Sarah remained captive. The tension in the small room was palpable, but a ray of hope had emerged with Nancy's revelation. "We have to find a way to communicate with your father," Sarah whispered. "If Nancy is willing to help us, we might have a chance." Michael nodded, his mind working frantically. "If we could access a phone, even for a moment." Their whispers were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Nancy entered, her face a mask of fear and determination. "We don't have much time," she said quickly, as she began to untie Michael. "Hawkins left for an hour. It's our only chance." Sarah looked at her with surprise. "Nancy, are you sure? What about your son?" Nancy's eyes filled with tears. "My son, he would never forgive me if he knew what I've done. I have to do the right thing, for him and for you." As Nancy freed them, Michael put a hand on her shoulder. "I promise we'll do everything possible to save your son too." Cautiously, the three slipped through the dark hallways of the building. Nancy guided them to a small office where there was a phone. "Quick," she urged, "call Richard. Tell him not to come alone to the exchange. Hawkins has prepared a trap." Michael dialed his father's number with trembling fingers. After several interminable rings, Richard answered. "Michael, is that you?" Richard's voice was laden with emotion and relief. "Dad, listen," Michael whispered urgently. "Don't. Come alone to the exchange Hawkins plans." Suddenly, the line went dead. Michael looked at the phone in horror, only to realize that Victor Hawkins was standing in the office doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. "Well, well," said Hawkins, his voice dangerously soft. "It seems we have a little mutiny on our hands." Nancy stepped in front of Michael and Sarah, facing Hawkins. "It's over, Victor. No more lies, no more manipulations." Hawkins laughed, a humorless sound. "Oh, Nancy, always so noble. Have you forgotten what's at stake? What will happen to your precious son if you don't cooperate?" Nancy's face paled, but she stood firm. "My son would rather see me do the right thing than live with the shame of my actions." Hawkins pulled out a gun, pointing it at them. "How touching, but I'm afraid you've made a grave mistake, one that you'll all pay dearly for." Meanwhile, Richard, alerted by Michael's interrupted call, prepared to act. He gathered his team and headed towards the exchange location, determined to put an end to this nightmare once and for all. What no one knew was that Elizabeth, Richard's small but astute granddaughter, had been eavesdropping on the adults' conversations. With a courage and determination unusual for her age, she had decided to take matters into her own hands. While everyone focused on the imminent confrontation, Elizabeth snuck out of the mansion, determined to help her family in the only way she knew how. The night advanced, and the threads of fate intertwined, leading all involved towards a final confrontation that would change their lives forever. Long buried, secrets were about to come to light, and the price of truth would be higher than any of them could imagine. The tension in the air was palpable as Richard Anderson and his team approached the exchange location. The old port warehouse loomed before them, grim and threatening under the moonlight. Richard felt the weight of the Project Phoenix documents in his briefcase, aware that what he was about to do would change the course of many lives. "Remember the plan," Richard whispered to his companions. "No matter what happens, the priority is to get Michael and Sarah out of there safe and sound." Gabriel, who was at his side, nodded gravely. "And destroy those documents, Richard. We can't let Hawkins get his hands on them." As they approached the warehouse entrance, a movement in the shadows caught their attention. To their surprise and horror, they saw a small figure sneaking towards a side entrance. "Elizabeth?" Richard gasped, recognizing his granddaughter. "My God, no!" Without thinking twice, Richard rushed in pursuit of Elizabeth, momentarily forgetting the plan. Gabriel and the others followed him, aware that the situation had just become exponentially more complicated. Inside the warehouse, Hawkins kept Michael, Sarah, and Nancy at gunpoint. The sound of approaching footsteps put him on alert. "It seems your father has finally arrived, Michael," Hawkins said with a malicious smile. "I hope he's ready to pay for his sins." Michael tried to free himself from his bindings, desperate to protect his family. "Hawkins, this is between you and my father. Let Sarah and Nancy go." Hawkins laughed without humor. "Oh, but you're wrong. This involves all of us. Each of you will play your part in Richard Anderson's downfall." Suddenly, the warehouse door burst open. Richard entered, panting, with Elizabeth clinging to his hand. "Dad!" Michael shouted, his voice a mixture of relief and fear. Hawkins seemed momentarily disconcerted by the girl's presence, but quickly regained his composure. Well, Richard, it seems you've brought the whole family. How touching." Richard took a step forward, protectively positioning himself in front of Elizabeth. "It's over, Victor. I have the documents you want. Let them go and let's end this once and for all." Hawkins extended his free hand. "The documents first, Richard. You know you're in no position to negotiate." Richard looked around, assessing the situation. Michael, Sarah, and Nancy were tied up, but unharmed. Elizabeth clung to his leg, trembling but with determination in her eyes. He could feel Gabriel and the rest of his team taking positions outside the warehouse. With a deep sigh, Richard stepped forward, holding the briefcase. "Before I hand this over to you, Victor, there's something everyone needs to know. The truth about Project Phoenix." Hawkins narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "What game are you playing, Richard?" "No game," Richard replied firmly. "Just the truth." Project Phoenix wasn't just a technological development plan. It was an advanced artificial intelligence program designed to predict and manipulate global financial markets. A collective gasp ran through the room. Michael looked at his father with a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. "That's why you abandoned it. That's why you walked away from everything." Richard nodded sadly. "When I realized the power we had created, the damage it could cause in the wrong hands, I knew we had to stop it. But Victor, he wanted to take it further." Hawkins let out a bitter laugh. "Further? We were on the brink of controlling the world economy, Richard. We could have changed the world. We would have destroyed it." Richard corrected. "And that's why I can't allow these documents to fall into your hands or anyone else's." With a quick movement, Richard opened the briefcase and pulled out a lighter. Before Hawkins could react, he set fire to the documents. "No!" Hawkins roared, lunging towards Richard. At that moment, everything seemed to happen at once. Gabriel and Richard's team burst into the warehouse. Michael took advantage of the distraction to free himself and protect Sarah and Nancy Elizabeth, showing a bravery beyond her years, ran towards Hawkins and kicked him in the shin, making him lose his balance amidst the chaos. Hawkins' gun went off. The sound of the shot echoed through the warehouse, followed by a cry of pain. When the dust settled, Richard lay on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Hawkins was immobilized by Gabriel and the security team, the Project Phoenix. Documents burned, taking with them the secrets of a dark past. Michael ran to his father with Elizabeth at his side. "Dad, are you okay?" Richard smiled weakly, looking at his son and granddaughter. "I'll be fine. The important thing is that you're safe." Sarah, freed by Nancy, joined them, hugging Elizabeth tightly. "It's all over, sweetheart, we're safe." As police sirens approached, Hawkins, handcuffed and defeated, looked at Richard with a mixture of hatred and respect. "You were always smarter than me, Richard, but this isn't over. The truth always comes to light." Richard, helped to his feet by Michael, looked at Hawkins with determination. "You're right, Victor. The truth does come to light, and I'm ready to face the consequences of my actions, whatever they may be." In the weeks that followed, the story of Project Phoenix came to public light. Richard Anderson, in an act of transparency, confessed his involvement and that of his former partners. Although there were legal and financial consequences, his honesty and repentance were taken into account. The Anderson family, more united than ever by the trials they had faced, stood together throughout the process. Michael, recognizing his father's mistakes but also his sacrifice, worked tirelessly to preserve the legitimate legacy of the family. Business Nancy, thanks to the testimony of the Anderson family, was absolved of the most serious charges and reunited with her son, beginning the long process of healing and forgiveness. Elizabeth, the unexpected little heroine, grew up with a deep understanding of the value of family and the importance of doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. Years later, on a sunny afternoon, the Anderson family gathered in the mansion's garden. Richard, now grey-haired but with bright eyes, proudly watched as Michael played with Elizabeth. Now a vivacious and intelligent teenager, Sarah approached Richard, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" Richard smiled, his eyes moist with emotion. "How fortunate. We are, despite everything, despite my mistakes, we've managed to build something beautiful." Michael, noticing the conversation, approached with Elizabeth, "And we'll keep building it, Dad, together." Elizabeth hugged her grandfather. "We're the Andersons, we can overcome anything." As the sun set on the horizon, bathing the garden in golden hues, the Anderson family stood united, a living testimony that love, honesty, and forgiveness can overcome even the darkest secrets and the most difficult trials. The Anderson legacy was no longer a fortune or a business empire. It was the unconditional love of a family that had learned in the hardest way that truth and love are the most valuable treasures one can possess.